Thanks for coming. Appreciate everyone being here. If those of you who don't know me, I'm a partner with the Van CFO, JB Henriksen. I get to introduce the illustrious panel and talk a little bit about the same things they talked about upstairs. Hopefully we'll go in a little more depth, hopefully be a little bit better than what we even heard earlier, I hope. We'll see. So our panelists, I don't know them as well as I like to. Al, I do. So Al and I go way back. We're both Deloitte alumni. I've known each other for a long time. I've tried to pull some information. You know, most recently, there's different companies that I haven't even heard of, so hopefully you can tell us a little more about some of those and some war stories. Most recently with OptConnect. You may remember from Alpine Confections was one that I've heard of. Bear Creek Country Kitchens, that one I've heard of. And the one that most of us have heard of is Huntsman Corporation. So I'll jump from there, from Deloitte, working for Huntsman. And so as we go through here, what I want you to do is, because I want you to tell, I was going to pull up some dirt on each of you. And I figured, you know what, maybe it's better if you just tell something unique about you that you like to do different. So Al, I'm going to start with you as we make the intro. Something unique that's different about you as a person.
Well, I don't know if it's different about me, but I'm one of those people that received the fine letter from the Mormon Tabernacle Choir saying you failed and we don't want you.
Interesting. Okay, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
All right. Greg Iverson, most recently with Overstock, still with Overstock.
No, I left Overstock about a month ago.
About a month ago, that's right. Apollo Education Group, don't know much about them. US Air, I do. Also another Deloitte alumni. I'm glad to hear that. I forgot to mention that Al did graduate from that school down south. We do have a guy wearing his tie up here.
He gets double CPE credit?
It gets double CPE.
Okay.
Just because you guys are putting up with a good season. You can only beat good teams. You can't beat bad teams.
That's true.
And Greg graduated from University of Idaho. And Greg, tell us a little something different about you as well.
Something different about me. Well, I buy a lot of products from the company that Aaron works for. So I'm a loyal customer, buying a lot of backcountry ski gear, and then I also race mountain bikes when I'm not working.
Oh, I didn't know you were a backcountry skier. We need to talk.
Yeah.
We need to chat. One of my favorite things to do. And so, yeah, backcountry is, to me, is a great country, a great company. I love all the gear there. I spent way more money there than I should have. So I wanted to make sure I didn't pronounce his name incorrectly. It's Kuehne?
Kuehne.
Kuehne? Yeah. So it's Aaron Kuehne. You want to get that? I want to make sure I get that right. Ever since Key and Peele has done that, right? Yes. You probably get that all the time.
All the time.
Yeah, anyway.
We embrace it.
But it's still funny.
For sure.
All right, and so Black Diamond, KPMG alumni. I know Kevin Johansson really well. Glad he's an endorser of yours. He spoke really highly of you as I was talking to him. U of U alumni, which we're always glad to hear. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so one of my favorite things to do is to go out early in the morning, especially during the wintertime with the headlamp and with skis and skins, and to trek up mountains and to get the first runs of the morning by earning them. So that's one of my most passions during the winter season, and I enjoy doing that during the summer as well with my dog out on the trail.
Fantastic. Well, I can say, Al, you're going to have to join us when we earn our turns with our little bit of backcountry skiing. Although the problem is that I can't keep up with these guys anymore, right? These young guys run up the mountains, and I'm still huffing and puffing getting up there. But it's still fun to earn the turns. So that's good to know. Appreciate that. So our panel today is really talking about an article from Deloitte called CFO Insights, the Strategic CFO. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I say a little bit tongue-in-cheek that they did talk a little bit about what we want to talk about in the panel, because we talked a lot about strategic, and that's really more and more what the CFO should be doing, right? So there are four main orientations that this article talks about. Number one, a responder. Number two, a challenger. They talked a lot about that today as far as being the sparring partner. Number three, an architect. And number four, a transformer. So I don't know if you guys are ready to respond to those, but let's talk about, I'd like each of you to just talk a little bit about each of those four, if you would. How you have been a responder. Al, I'll let you start. How you've been a responder in your role as a CFO.
Sure. Can everybody hear me? I just need to know because these mics are,
If you
they've
wanna
got
scoot
two
that
mics for
over.
3 people,
Yeah.
I guess.
I'll just take this.
So, I have worked for 8 or 9 different companies, and in each one I seem to have a little bit of a different role. So as I was thinking about this, one of the things I've learned when I come into a company is I ask the CEO, what has been the attributes of a good CFO that you have worked with? And then you'll get a clear understanding of what they think about CFOs. And then I ask them, what are some things that really bother you about a CFO? And then we try to talk about strategy. So as a responder, I worked for a company called Great Basin Trucks. And we owned 10 dealerships, large truck dealerships around the United States. And my role was only to be a responder. All they wanted to know from the CFO was what was going on at the dealerships at month end, what were the highs and lows, and what corrective actions needed to be taken. And in that case, I almost felt as if a controller could have taken this position until I began to learn the stories behind the numbers. And then as a responder, you not only report, but then you begin to develop the corrective actions and recommendations that people can follow. And I think that's one of the differences between a controller and then a CFO in a responder role of just responding to different situations is how to interpret what should happen next.
Fantastic. I think that's really true, because you're right. A lot of times as a responder, you feel like you're kind of doing a knee-jerk reaction, but you can be a little bit strategic about it. Greg?
I guess my thought on the responder type CFO, and I'm now, as I mentioned, I left Overstock about 5 weeks ago. I was a CFO there, and before that I was CFO of Apollo Education Group. So Apollo is a global education company, owned University of Phoenix, a bunch of other colleges and universities across the globe, also a public company. But now, today, so I get a lot of job specifications for different CFO roles and get a chance to read through those. And I can't think of one that doesn't say that they want or need or require a strategic CFO. And so I don't know if that's just part of how the different search firms, if it's part of a template that they use and they continue to kind of roll that forward and update it. But I think it's important as you go through an interview process to really assess whether the company is looking for a strategic CFO or whether the company is looking for somebody who is more of a responder. I think part of that need or want is going to be influenced on the predecessor. So getting a sense of the former CFO, the person who's in that seat before, how did they operate? How were they viewed by the organization? What did the CEO want from that person? What did the board want? And there may not necessarily be complete alignment. I think as you go through an interview process, I think the reality is the CEO may want something different than, say, what the other members of the board want or what the shareholders or the investors want. And so I think making sure, you go into a situation or a role having a clear understanding of how the CFO should be positioned or the expectations of that CFO, making sure that aligns with your expectations and what you want and expect to contribute in the role, that, like I said, that there is good alignment between what you expect to bring to the role and what the organization is looking for.
Fantastic. Aaron?
So when I initially read this, I did think that the responder CFO role was kind of outdated, candidly.
I can't disagree.
And so for me, it didn't really apply or what didn't really resonate, but I do believe that there's certain aspects of the responder CFO that do still exist or are required, especially as it relates to, helping run a publicly traded company. As we know, our primary role as chief financial executives or financial executives is to help create value for our businesses, create value for our employees, for our shareholders, et cetera, et cetera. But there are certain elements that do relate to compliance and administrative type work. And I think that's where the responder role does come into play and is still foundational to financial executives, especially, as I say, for certain types of companies, especially those publicly traded, because that is still an element of what it means to be publicly traded, to have that compliance, to deal with the 90-day, reviews that come about, SOX, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that can't be your primary focus, because to the point made before, that's where you start to combine the roles between CFO and controller, but that still is that still is an element of your overarching responsibility.
Yeah, no, and I agree, and I think, Al, the way you address that really is the responder's job, right? I mean, we have to have good, solid financials on a timely and accurate. But now our job is to take one step further, and then let's make sure that we're doing analysis on them, and let's make sure that we understand the story behind those numbers, so we can go fix things, right? Fix things that are broken. If they're not broken, let's leave them alone and make sure that we know how that works. So I think that's an important part of it, as being a good CFO. We don't necessarily need to go through all these other ones as far as Challenger, but I do want to talk about the Challenger one, just because they talked about this this morning on the first panel. So I worked with Holiday Oil when we had to slowly transform the former CFO out and bring James in. So I helped interview James to bring him in as the CFO at Holiday Oil. And as Mike was talking about, he butted heads with the former CFO every single day. And that was really hard for him. And now he and James get along really well, and so life is better. Maybe you can tell a little bit about some places where you butted heads with the CEO, and has it been a good confrontation or a bad confrontation, or both, and sometimes either one. So let's start with Greg, if you would, this time.
Butting heads with CEOs. I guess I have some recent experience with that.
And no one that's very strong-willed or anything that we would know of.
No. Look, I've had a chance now to work in a couple of founder-led organizations, and so the organization I just left recently, Overstock, who in this room hasn't read a headline about Overstock's former CEO, right? So clearly a controversial figure. And, I knew going in, it's an important role for a CEO, or I'm sorry, for a CFO, when you're in a founder-led company, right? And so if you think about what's in the DNA of a founder CEO, often very much a risk taker, somebody who's going to be on the forefront in that kind of bleeding edge area. And so, and particularly if you're a public company, right? And so some of the areas that I think you're natural to probably find some conflict. One would be in how you allocate capital, where the company is spending its money, and expectations for returns on that capital allocation. Certainly, guidance is another one, and expectations of financial performance of the business. And so I think CEOs in general, forget about being a founder CEO, but just CEOs in general, you're probably not going to be a successful CEO if you're not an eternal optimist. And so certainly I don't think a CFO should be a pessimist, but needs to be a realist, and so needs to be, I think, that sounding board to help the CEO and the organization as a whole remain somewhat grounded. And so I think that leads to some healthy debates, and in some cases can lead to some conflicts. I think both parties are probably going to have pretty strong viewpoints, but I think that's really an important part of the CFO to be grounded in data, grounded in the facts, and be, to the extent it's necessary, sort of be that counterbalance to what may be an overly optimistic CEO.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because a lot of times I've been called the chief no officer, right? Because that's what you do. You tell them no. But I think you're right. Sometimes you need to be the person to ground them and bring them back to reality. Because if they're really, really gung ho, they're going to find a way to get it done. So, Aaron.
I've been extremely fortunate to be partnered up with some amazing CEOs over the years, whether they be founder-led, but also transformational type CEOs. But that doesn't take away from the fact that we don't have certain conversations that need to be dealt with head on. And that's exactly how we refer to it internally, is that we know, especially the seat that we're in, we have the best view. We can see the entire playground. And frankly, we're one of the best or one of the few individuals within the organization that seems to be able to have the ability to connect the dots from A to Z. Where not many people can actually do that because one, they don't have the context, but also they don't have that mindset. And that's not disparaging, right? We love our designers, we love our marketing folks because they're creative and they create hype and they bring innovative product to market. But we do have the distinct responsibility to be able to help gather the team together and to be disciplined in our approach in driving value or in driving decision-making processes. And so at times that puts us in a controversial or into a potentially frictional relationship with folks, and our responsibility, at least my approach has always been, instead of being that CF no, let's be solution oriented, but also not wavering from where we believe we should be heading. And so as a result, we end up having a lot of conversations, and I tell the folks from the onset, look, we're gonna just hit this head on, so let's not beat around the bush, we can be all passionate about it, but let's not get emotional. Because once it gets emotional, now it becomes personal. And if we can leave the emotions outside of the door and gather around the table and focus on the key objective of what we're trying to accomplish, which is winning, the definition of strategy, then we will find the best solution. But our responsibility is to be disciplined in that approach, to bring the cool head to the table, but also to not waver. Because I do believe that at times we, will acquiesce to the head honcho or to the CEO, and they are the leaders. But also we have a responsibility, and frankly, we're held to a higher standard, especially by shareholders, by the board, and by our employees to ensure that certain things are considered, but also the execution then follows.
Right on target. I appreciate that, Aaron, because I think you're exactly right. There are times when you're going to have that conflict. That you got to kind of be in step when you get there. But there are some times when you have to stick to your guns, and that's sometimes a hard thing to do, especially when your boss is telling you otherwise.
But that's where you then have to have a response as to why. It can't just be, nope, not doing it. It's, no, really understand what's taking place in the business.
Yep.
And I think that's the other key element, which we'll get into. But, we need to be operators. We need to understand even better than, someone in marketing or someone in sales the go-to-market process, so that we can clearly articulate our point of view as to why we believe our approach is actually better and will create, a better GTM process or, better consumer experience, But we need to be intimate with that so that we can actually have those conversations. Because if we're just sitting behind a spreadsheet, which I know none of us do anymore, right? Then you just can't be part of those conversations because you're not relevant to the conversation either.
Yeah, no, right on target. Al?
Yeah, I have two thoughts on being in the challenger role. I think in that role you have to be probably the best communicator, because your objective is not to say no. Your objective is to explain the consequences of the decisions clearly, because most people I work with really want to make a lot of money. They really do. And as you go through different ideas that they might be very passionate about, you need to be able to explain the consequences not only on the organization, but of the earnings of the company and what will happen. So one of the most interesting situations I was involved with was at Bear Creek Country Kitchens, which was a turnaround, and we had a new CEO, and we turned it around. It became profitable. And has anyone here bought any Bear Creek Country Kitchen soup? Green bag, dehydrated soup. It's all dehydrated. He came in one day and said, well, we've got 8 facings in almost every store of dehydrated soup. I think we've maxed out on that in the marketplace. It's time we go into a soup in a bag that's fully prepared. So he had decided that was the strategy, and that's what we were going to do. Now, when you think about that, you have a whole group of people who are experts in dehydrated product, now trying to become experts in a hydrated product that is supposed to taste good when it's heated in a bag and comes out of a bag. Luckily, I was smart enough not to say no, But we began then to study the ramifications both for personnel and marketplace, or what we would look like in the marketplace, and cost. And as we discussed that, it became very apparent to me that what he was trying to communicate was, our sales will not grow where we are. We need to do something different. And we ended up going with the development of that new product. But we knew then at that point in time what the financial impact would probably be.
Yeah.
So that was a very eye-opening situation for both of us as we went through that.
Yeah. And he probably didn't think through the financial ramifications, other than he knew needed to grow.
Yeah, he needed sales.
Needed to sell, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really interesting. So I agree with what they're all saying, right? I think that the lines between a CFO and a COO are really blurry now. I think you are both. If you are a CFO, you better be in the middle of operations. If you're not in the middle of operations, you're behind. You're not really doing your job as a strategist. And so part of that is that we also need to figure out how to do things going forward. And that, again, how do we do things better? And that kind of fits to the last two pieces, which is architect and transformer. How do you do that? How do you make those changes? And so I had a really, really good CEO that I work with who had a really good analogy that I still use because I love it. He said, I'm sitting in the front seat of this car doing 80 miles an hour going down the freeway, and I am staring out that front windshield. And I want you, Mr. CEO, sitting right next to me, staring out that front windshield. I want you to occasionally look in the rearview mirror, but what's coming down the road? What obstacles are going to be there? What can we do strategically to get us where we need to be? Because I love exactly what you said, Greg, that we're here to win, right? That's part of what we're doing. We're here to win. And so talk a little bit about how things that you have architected or things that you've transformed in businesses to help the company be more strategic. Aaron, start that one.
The best example that I have is coming out of 2015, we just completed what some people call an exploration of strategic alternatives, where you, in essence, put the entire business up for sale. And that's exactly what we did. So over the years since I've been with Claris, so we're a holding company focused on the outdoor space, but I wouldn't say we buy and sell, but we are active in the M&A space, let's put it that way. And then in 2014, we just sold off a company called Gregory Mountain Products. And in 2015, we decided to look at selling off the rest of the business, which included Black Diamond and also a Swedish brand named POC, P-O-C. Well, at the end of the day, we ended up selling POC, but we didn't end up selling Black Diamond. And so what had fundamentally changed is our business model, because we came into this scenario being focused on what we used to call a multi-brand enterprise focused on the outdoor space, but it was really platformizing the operations while also allowing the brand-facing activities to be autonomous. But as we came out of 2015, I was stuck with $15 million to $20 million of extra overhead and a single brand, and we'd then taken a business that was doing $250 to $275 million down to $150. And we had to restructure or re-architect the business. And coming out of 2015, I sat down with our chairman and we decided that we would shift away from the premise or the structure that we developed. Instead, we would focus on what we believe to be superfan brands and to focus on allowing them, recognizing that what makes a brand so unique and so different is its culture, its DNA. And so to no longer focus on synergies, no longer focus on platformizing certain operations, which I can tell you as I interact with Wall Street on a regular basis, that concept causes certain people to pause. But it's turned out to be the right decision, and the reason for it is that we understood what these businesses represented to an end consumer. And when you start to take away the focus of every employee within that brand, you start to dilute the effectiveness that it has within the marketplace. Because remember, it's not about how much you can save in warehousing space or warehousing fees. It's how you interact with the end consumer. And so what we wanted to have verticals that were solely focused on those activities. And so that's what we did. We restructured, we re-architected the business, and that's the platform, or that's the business model that we run today. And since then, we've acquired 3 additional businesses, and we run that similar type of model. And what it actually does, not only does it keep things extremely clean, it keeps things, the accountability very clear, but it also ensures that the employees that are assigned to those businesses are very clear as to their roles and responsibilities, and they embrace the cultural aspect, which is so important to us. And so now anyone within a particular brand, whether it be the president or the individual working on the manufacturing floor or someone in the in the distribution center, they know who they're working for and they know the consumer that they're serving. And so that has been a huge benefit for us, and it's really enabled us to accelerate the growth but also the profitability of the brands, because what we also saw as we would try to platformize or synergize certain activities, frankly, there ended up being duplicity or repetitiveness in the system, because although corporate or HQ or this service center wasn't doing it the way that these guys wanted at the regional level, they'd end up going out and adding that resource in the skies or in the name of something else, but it was really to do that activity that they weren't happy with. And so we've seen that, as a huge benefit.
Oh, fascinating. I get it. Being a backcountry gear geek, you've done your job, because it really is a culture that you really love, and you embrace it. Greg, you want to take a swing at that?
Sure. So I guess kind of piggybacking on what Aaron just described in terms of being an organization that's pursuing strategic alternatives, I had that experience while I was at Apollo Education Group as well. So I was there for about 11 years. We were a public company. The board began pursuing strategic alternatives. This is shortly after I became CFO. And ultimately decided to take the company private. And so worked through that take private process. It took about a year and a half from start to finish. So it was a long process. And then all of a sudden the private equity acquirers, one day the transaction finally closes, and then now they own this business, and they hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about what they do with it, which for us from the leadership team was a huge surprise, because we were acquired by one of the largest private equity firms out there, and that's what these guys do for a living. They raise capital and they buy companies and do different things, and usually make a lot of money in the process. So as part of this, there was an expectation that the private equity sponsors were going to take the company, which was really a holding company, a parent company, and had a bunch of educational assets across the globe, and begin to divest each of those businesses individually. And so as part of that, you no longer need a corporate office, right? You don't need corporate shared services. You don't need this executive team. And so I thought that I'd be leaving the company along with the CEO, the COO, general counsel, the other members of the C-suite. But at the 11th hour, the private equity sponsors recognized they really needed somebody from the senior team to stay behind and lead this transition, help them figure out what it is they just acquired and how they can make money in this acquisition. So they ended up tapping me for that role, and it ended up being an interesting experience, because the rest of the C-suite exited the company, and I looked around and I was sort of the last person left. But it really afforded an opportunity to think about the company differently, because as a public company, you have commitments that you make to the CEO makes to the board, commitments that the CEO makes to Wall Street. There's a certain expectation and sort of a continuity of strategy that once you've gone out for a couple of quarters to the board or to the shareholders and said, this is what we're doing and here's why we're doing it, it's hard to go back and say, you know what, that either wasn't the right decision or the market's changed, the situation's changed, what we thought was the right thing to do is no longer the right thing to do. If you fast forward to a private equity setting, you have new owners who aren't tied to any of the decisions from the past. They're looking at it purely from a financial and economic lens, which is how do we maximize EBITDA and how do we maximize free cash flow? So for me, it really afforded the opportunity to sort of unwind and change some of the decisions that we'd made in the past and do so in a much faster time frame than a public company typically gets to operate. So over the course of this 13-month transition leader assignment, it helped, I think, sort of rationalize some of these decisions. Many of them weren't necessarily bad decisions, but they were decisions that were longer term in nature. So a public company that can operate with a strategy thinking forward, decades into the future, versus a typical private equity sponsor that's thinking in sort of a 3 to 5 year window. And so I think over the course of that, 13 months, like I said, was able to feel like a real architect of strategy and an advisor and a partner to these private equity firms and help them get off to a great start with their investments and ultimately be successful with that acquisition.
Fantastic. Thanks, Greg. Al?
You know, I've been so interested in their responses, I've forgotten the question. It's so fascinating to learn from
No,
other people.
I totally agree, because both of them have hit on, and frankly, you kind of hit on it the last one where you were talking about how you can be part of the transformation and the architecture of that change going forward.
Well, he just mentioned private equity firms, so that's a bulk of my experience is dealing with private equity firms. And so I guess I've been through several architecture processes and issues because each one comes in, and as you were talking, I was thinking one of the things that I've always had to be aware of when I have a private equity firm involved is sometimes it really doesn't matter what the CEO wants because it's a private equity firm that drives the decisions, and you need to be aware of what their expectations are with this investment and where they want the EBITDA to be, because they only think in a 3 to 5 year horizon typically, sometimes 7 years. And that makes some of the decision making a little bit different. And so I was just involved with a company, if I could digress just a minute,
Please.
we were going through from one private equity company to another, and during a sales process, you always have that architect transformative time because now you have outside people looking at your business, and they will look at it different than you have looked at the data. They will see things, they will measure things that you might have never seen before. So we started to transform the business, and we had a management retreat where we decided on our strategy on a go-forward basis that helped us through this whole transition, and we were very successful in that. And then we had an outside consultant come in that had our management team go through a strategy session. What is our strategy? And when we started it, it was a surprise to me that even after the whole private equity process, there were 5 of us on the team, and there were 5 different answers as to what our strategy was. And we were growing at a 25 to 30% rate on a recurring revenue model at a 50% EBITDA rate. Cash was coming in left and right. So we thought we had a really good strategy going forward. Well, at the end of the process that we followed, we came up with one strategy we're all unified in, and it dealt with modems, and modems are a dime a dozen. But the company I just left has a patent on a certain modem type that's being rolled out. And it is a very interesting transformation of the whole company and architecting something when you have a group that decides this is our one goal. And all the other things you typically think of strategy are just, I'm just trying to get things done to reach the goal. And so I think that's the most recent experience I've had in a whole transformation architect process.
I appreciate that. I think there's a lot to be said for that, but there's also a lot to be said for working with private equity. You know, working with small companies that are wholly owned or publicly traded are even different than private equity.
Right.
Where it's the golden rule. Those who have the gold make the rules. And they will help you tell what the strategy is. And the CEO may not know what that strategy is. He may think he knows,
Right.
but the PE will tell them what it is. So we got a few more questions we can ask, but we've got about 10 minutes. So I figure what probably the best thing is to open up to questions for you and for the panel. So if you have for in general or specific ones, please.
Question for the gentleman here, where you mentioned your company as you're leading into the re-architecturing of it there in your last comment. You're doing well there, and yet you're orienting to an entirely new strategy. What's the thought process or the tension involved with transforming the company versus adding to the company? adding a new strategy?
Money, lots and lots of money. We all, from my perspective, your objective as a team is to maximize whatever creative resources you have to maximize your revenue and profits. And sometimes in companies, we have people who have all sorts of abilities and we don't necessarily recognize them, and all sorts of ideas. And it's very rare that we take time to pull key individuals and ask, what are some things you think could really change our company? What would you do? What are our customers saying? What are needs that you see? So we were doing well, but it's the desire to make more money and to have a secure go-forward path, because there's always people trying to replace or replicate what you're doing. A key strategy has to involve, what is the competition doing? Too many people look at strategy as internal, and part of the process should be to see what the competition is doing as you are executing your strategy. What are they doing? Because it's a war every day, in my opinion.
Yeah, no,
Good question.
I agree. Great question. Other questions? No other question. Please.
Have any of you partnered with your chief of HR executive or head of HR to sustain a better competitive advantage in the marketplace?
Very much so. So that's one of our actual strategic, we have 5 building blocks, and one of them is around the recruitment and retention of employees and being one of the best places to work within our respective spaces. So for every one of our brands, we want them to be looked at as being the place to work, because it's all about the people, right? It's all about the teams and making something happen. And so it's so important that actually HR reports into myself to make sure that HR has the proper voice and is focused in the way that will help activate or facilitate our strategic initiatives, and to the point where we've called it out as a separate building block.
Yeah, it's kind of funny you say that. I just repeat these dumb idioms that I've heard for so many years. But we oftentimes call the head of HR the chief morale officer, right? Because your most important assets walk out the door every day, right? You may have some other different assets, but if you don't have people that are happy and engaged, then you're not there. Al, you had a comment?
I was just going to say, my experience with human resources is if you have an incorrect person there, it will cause mayhem in your company. I would make sure you have the right human resources person.
Yeah, critical. Please.
How do you help a CEO that everything has like a million strategies, a million different directions? How do you help the CFO direct or pull it down to you to focus?
Prioritization. It's so that what we do, because we have an amazing president of Claris that has just phenomenal ideas, but that at times can be viewed as just a stream of, at times I'll refer to it as a waterfall, in that it's a waterfall of information, of ideas that will come upon us. If we're not careful, it'll drown us. And so the focus is, one, make sure that communication or those ideas are properly communicated, or with the appropriate level of context to the appropriate people, right? You don't want that to trickle down all the way down to the front line, because it'll create chaos or it'll create confusion as to where we're going. Those are discussions that need to be confined within a leadership session or an offsite. But then also, and this is where I do believe that the CFO has the ability to help foster this, but also control it because of the role. But then what needs to happen, and I know it's simple, but it's gotten to the point where it's like, okay, let's prioritize. And what you'll see happen, right, is that people will put up bullet points. Okay, these are my 10 priorities. I'm like, sequence them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now let's start to put dollars behind them. Because what you'll see, right, is that now as you start to sequence, it makes them get more focused on what truly is important. But then also, as you look at number 4, getting the bulk of the capital, that's really not, are we sure that that's really how we're prioritizing or how we're viewing these different ideas or these different strategies? And I know it's simple, but there's something to be said about sophistication and simplicity. And I've found that to be a very effective way to help calibrate or to help the entire team, let alone a CEO, go through that process. And I do believe it's the CFO's responsibility to help drive that because, once again, at the end of the day, strategy plus execution equals financial results, and you're responsible for those financial results. And so you've got to be very entrenched on the front end of the development of those strategies, those priorities, the capital allocation, and then the execution of those items.
Fantastic. I mean, it goes back to what we talked about before, that our job as a CFO is a chief grounding officer. You have to kind of sometimes rein in the CEO and prioritize, which I think is great. Greg, you kind of hit on that earlier. Other questions?
Do you have any thoughts on creative ways to say yes when you really mean no?
Give them a very big spreadsheet, have them read through it.
I think that ties into the last question as well, and I think prioritization. So first, I think I don't know I've ever been in an organization that didn't struggle with that initiative overload, and there's just simply more opportunities than there are resources, whether it's human capital or financial capital. And so the only way I've seen it effectively managed is through a prioritization, and so I like to address it at the beginning or as we're going through the budgeting process. And so not having each department really come up with their strategic initiatives, but come up with the initiatives for the overall organization and do the funding that way. Inevitably, other ideas will be generated throughout the year. That idea generation doesn't just happen in the budgeting process. And so that's when this prioritization becomes really important, because sometimes it may be the right thing to do to deprioritize or postpone one of the strategic initiatives that was already approved in the budgeting process and already underway. And so I think kind of going back to your question specifically about saying yes when the answer is no is a matter of timing. And so it can be the answer can be yes, but not today. This is something that we will get to, but it's a matter of when it becomes a top priority. And there's a number of great ideas that I think just end up needing to be placed in a parking lot and dealt with later once some of the other more pressing or more important initiatives are accomplished.
That actually is a great way to deflect some of those questions, right? Just push it down the road in a nice way. Yeah. So we're kind of running out of time. And I just wanted to we got started before our sponsor got in here. So Brent Hawkins from BTJD, the great law firm that we use all the time. You have anything you want to add, Brent?
No, great panel, great panelists, great moderator as well, JB.
No, I don't know about that, but any last parting shots about strategy?
I guess I would just, when you go back to work today, ask your peers what the strategy of the company is. And if you get too many different answers, then you have an opportunity as a CFO to pull the team together and come up with a strategy you think will be successful for your company.
I appreciate that. Greg, anything else?
I guess I'd just say I think the article that this panel is based on, I think it's a good article. There's some good learnings in there. So for any of you who haven't already read it, I recommend pulling up a copy. It's a very short read, and also a plug for Deloitte. So Deloitte is the author of the article and invests a lot within their CFO program. So it's probably worth subscribing to their news feed as well. Give you some more insights.
Yeah, and if you don't have a copy or can't get access, shoot me an email. Happy to get you a copy. Aaron?
One of the things that we've been asked to do as a management team over the last couple of years by our board is to think bigger, to dream to think outside of what we're even contemplating. And we believe that at times our goals are pretty aspirational, but they continue to come back and say, think bigger. What are you doing to make bigger moves and to go faster? And it's in such a way that it doesn't put undue stress on us as a management team or as an organization to make bad decisions. But it's a genuine request that we've taken to heart. And so, my colleague and myself, I know I think about this every morning, is what can we do differently today than what we did yesterday, and how can we do it faster? And, being the left brain or whatever we are in this room, we tend to be a little bit more conservative. But I do think that that's also something that we need to be thinking about as heads of finance or CFOs, whatever you want to call it, is how do we create these big moves within the organization, and how do we increase the speed at which we do it?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, these are three very strategic CFOs. I appreciate you guys being here. The thing that I've learned out of from these guys is ask the right questions, right? Continually ask the questions. What are our goals? How are we going to win? What are we going to do to win? And those are great things to do. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.